I'll pay for him.
The sky above Dusty Creek had gone the color of a dying fire, amber bleeding into rust when the executioner's hand found the lever. Caleb Thorne didn't close his eyes. He'd stopped praying somewhere around the second day of his trial when he realized the verdict had been written before a single witness opened their mouth. The crowd below him smelled of sweat and satisfaction. These weren't people seeking justice. They were people seeking a show. Then, a voice. "I'll pay for him." It didn't shout. It didn't beg. It simply landed the way an axe lands. Clean, final, impossible to ignore. Abigail Sterling pushed through the front row, satchel in one hand, her father's land deed folded against her chest like scripture. The crowd parted the way crowds do when something shocks them out of cruelty, slowly and with their mouths open. "I invoke the mercy ledger." The executioner froze. Somewhere behind the platform, Mayor Barnaby Vance went very, very still. And Caleb Thorne, condemned man, accused killer, forgotten soul, exhaled for the first time in 3 days. This story is just getting started, and trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? The ride to Sterling Star was 4 miles of silence and dry wind. Caleb sat in the back of Abby's buckboard, wrists still bound in the county's iron, watching Dusty Creek shrink behind them like a bad dream you can't quite shake. The townsfolk had watched them leave with the particular expression of people who'd been robbed of their entertainment, mouths tight, eyes narrow, already rehearsing what they'd say about Abigail Sterling on Sunday supper. He'd tried to speak twice on the platform. Both times, Abby had simply continued her transaction with the territorial clerk without acknowledging him. Not dismissive, just focused, like he was a problem she was solving, not a person she'd saved. He supposed for now that was fair enough. The ranch appeared over a low hill as the sun finally surrendered the sky to purple dusk. Sterling Star. Even half broken, it had bones. A main house built from good timber, weathered silver gray but standing straight. A barn that leaned slightly eastward like it was listening for something. Fencing that ran long and honest across the scrubland. Some posts solid, others listing, others flat out missing like teeth knocked from a jaw. It had the look of a place that had once been loved and was quietly waiting to be loved again. Abby pulled the buckboard to a stop and climbed down without ceremony. She was not a small woman. The town had made sure she knew that her entire life, but she moved with a kind of grounded authority that Caleb, even in his current state, couldn't help but notice. She didn't move like someone apologizing for the space she took up. She moved like someone who owned the ground beneath her feet, because she did. She pulled a key from her coat pocket and unlocked his wrist irons. He rubbed the raw skin and looked up at her. "I haven't thanked you." "No," she agreed, "you haven't." She turned and walked toward the house. He took that as his cue to follow. Inside, a small woman named Hattie was pulling cornbread from a cast-iron stove. She had the kind of face that had laughed so many times the lines had simply decided to stay. She looked Caleb up and down with the unhurried assessment of someone who'd seen trouble walk through that door before and had opinions about it. "He's skinnier than I expected," Hattie said to Abby. "He'll fix that," Abby said. Caleb opened his mouth. "Sit," Abby said, without turning around. He sat. Over a meal he was too hungry to taste properly. Abby laid it out flat. No softness, no ceremony, just the terms of his survival, delivered the way she'd delivered everything else, with the quiet force of a woman who had stopped asking permission for her own words. He would work the Sterling Star Ranch for 5 years under the Mercy Ledger's bond. He would answer to her and to no one else. He would not leave the property without her permission for the first 90 days, territory law, not her preference, though her expression suggested she didn't much mind the rule. He would be fed, sheltered, and paid a modest wage held in trust until the bond expired. In return, she expected hard work, full days, no complaints she didn't earn. "What if I earn them?" Caleb asked. For the first time, something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the idea of one passing through. "Then I'll listen," she said. Dawn came indifferent and early. Hattie knocked on the door of the small bunkhouse with the enthusiasm of a woman who had never once in her life considered sleeping past first light a virtue. Caleb pulled on his boots in the gray dark, stepped outside, and found Abby already in the yard. She handed him a fence post and a mallet without preamble. The work was brutal and honest. 3 sections of the east fence had rotted through entirely, and the cattle, 12 head of lean, suspicious longhorns, had developed opinions about their freedom that needed correcting. The sun climbed, and so did the heat, and Caleb drove posts until his shoulders burned and his hands, soft from weeks in a jail cell, split at the knuckles. Abby worked beside him, not supervising, working, hauling wire, setting posts, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this since she was before she was tall enough to do it properly. By midday, Caleb had stopped thinking about the gallows. By late afternoon, he had stopped thinking about much at all. There was only the next post, the next stretch of wire, the dry earth that pushed back against every stake like it was testing whether he meant it. He meant it. When the sun finally dropped behind the ridge and Abby called the end of the day with a single word, enough, Caleb drove his last post in silence, straightened his back, and looked out across the mended fence line. It wasn't much, but it was something that hadn't been there that morning. He was beginning to understand that this is how Abigail Sterling measured the world, not in grand gestures, but in things made whole. The collapsed barn announced itself on the 3rd morning. The south wall had finally surrendered to a season of wind and neglect, taking a section of the roof down with it in a slow, graceless heap of timber and old nails. Abby stood at the edge of the wreckage with her arms folded and her jaw set, doing the kind of quiet arithmetic that has nothing to do with numbers, calculating will against circumstance, measuring how much was left of both. "We start with the crossbeams," she said. They worked in the particular silence of 2 people who have not yet decided what they are to each other. Caleb cleared debris, while Abby assessed which timbers could be salvaged and which were past saving. Hattie brought water at mid-morning and left it without commentary, which Caleb was beginning to recognize as her highest form of approval. It was the heat that loosened him. Or maybe it was the work itself, the way hard labor strips a man down to something simpler, something that has less use for the armor he's been wearing. By the time the sun was directly overhead and they'd stopped to eat in the barn's remaining shade, Caleb found the words arriving before he'd decided to speak them. "I was there that night, the night Elias Miller died." Abby set down her canteen slowly. She didn't look at him yet. A woman who'd learned to control her reactions the way frontier people learn to control fire, carefully and with full knowledge of what happens when you don't. "I know you were," she said. "That's what convicted you." "I found him. I didn't kill him. He was already on the ground when I rode up to the Miller property. Shot once, clean, through the left side, close range." He paused. "Professional range." Now she looked at him. "Elias was still breathing when I reached him. Barely. He grabbed my sleeve and said 2 things before he went. He said, 'The survey,' and then he said a name." The barn held its breath. "Vance," Caleb said. Abby's expression didn't collapse, it consolidated, the way a storm front organizes itself before it commits to becoming something serious. "You told the sheriff this?" "I told Iron Jack everything, word for word." His voice carried the flat, weathered quality of a man describing a wound that had long since stopped surprising him. "By the next morning, my testimony wasn't in the record. What was in the record was a witness, a man I'd never seen before in my life, placing me at the Miller property an hour before the time of death, with blood on my hands." "Who was the witness?" "One of Vance's regulators, goes by the name Cord." Abby stood. She walked to the edge of the collapsed wall and looked out across her land, the long, dry reach of it, the scrubland and the distant fence line they'd mended together 2 days prior. When she spoke again, her voice was careful and deliberate. Elias wrote to my father 6 weeks before he died. I found the letter in my father's desk after the funeral. I didn't understand it then. She turned. He mentioned a man he'd seen near the eastern boundary of his property. Someone taking measurements, using equipment Elias didn't recognize. Caleb went still. A surveyor. Someone posing as one, maybe. Elias wrote that the man rode off when he approached, said the horse carried a brand he didn't recognize, a double V mark. The double V, Vance's personal stock brand. Neither of them needed to say it. They stood in the ruins of the barn with the pieces assembling themselves between them, slow, reluctant, and inevitable, the way truth tends to arrive when it's been buried long enough. Elias Miller had stumbled on the railroad survey. He'd seen something or someone he wasn't supposed to, and before he could warn anyone with enough power to act on it, Barnaby Vance had silenced him and handed the sheriff a man to hang for it. A drifter, nameless enough, rootless enough, easy enough. Caleb looked at Abby. He needed someone to carry the blame, someone the town wouldn't fight for. Abby held his gaze without flinching. He underestimated what Elias meant to my father and what my father's land means to me. The afternoon wind moved through the broken barn walls like it was listening. They picked up their tools and went back to work, but something had shifted in the silence between them, quietly and permanently, like a fence post driven deep enough, finally, to hold. The mayor arrived on a Thursday. Caleb heard the horses first, 3 of them, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who have never had reason to doubt their welcome anywhere. He was on the roof of the repaired barn section, laying new shingles when the riders came through the main gate as though the gate were a formality rather than a boundary. He stayed where he was and watched. Barnaby Vance was not a large man, which Caleb suspected had shaped him considerably. He was trim and silver-haired, dressed in the kind of suit that had no business being in ranch country. Dark wool, brass buttons, a pocket watch chain that caught the morning light like a small, deliberate advertisement of itself. He rode a gray stallion with the practiced ease of a man performing the idea of authority rather than simply having it. 2 men flanked him. Caleb recognized the one on the left. Cord. The false witness. The regulator. He rode with his hat pulled low and his eyes moving across the property with the professional assessment of someone calculating what it would take to ruin it. Abby came out of the house before they'd fully dismounted. She wiped her hands on her work apron with the unhurried calm of a woman who has decided, somewhere deep and irrevocable, that she will not be the one to look away first. "Mayor Vance," she said, not a greeting. An acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge weather. "Miss Sterling," Vance removed his hat with the smooth, reflexive courtesy of a man who'd learned that manners are most useful as camouflage. "You're looking well." "I'm looking busy," Abby said. "What do you want?" Vance smiled the smile of a man who has never been spoken to that plainly by a woman half his age and has decided for now to find it charming. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, thick paper, official seal, the kind of paperwork designed to make the person receiving it feel small by comparison. "I've had my solicitor draw up a purchase offer for the Sterling property. Comprehensive, generous." He extended it toward her. "More than fair, Abigail." She didn't take it. "The ranch isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale," Vance said pleasantly. "It's only ever a matter of arriving at the right number. Then you'll be riding a long time, because there isn't one." The pleasantness didn't leave Vance's face so much as relocate, moving from his mouth to somewhere colder behind his eyes. He tucked the document back into his coat with the patience of a man rearranging a chess piece rather than conceding one. "I understand you've taken on a work bond," he said. His gaze drifted upward toward the barn roof, toward Caleb slowly and deliberately, the way a man points without using his finger. "Caleb Thorne, convicted killer." cleared under the mercy ledger, territorial law, which you know. The mercy ledger is a courtesy extended to landowners of standing. Standing, Miss Sterling, requires that a person remain above reproach. Harboring a man of Thorne's reputation, a man connected to the murder of Elias Miller, opens you to questions about your judgment, about your fitness to hold this deed. He paused, letting the implications settle like dust after a boot heel. Legal questions, the kind that tie up a property in territorial court for years, the kind that cost more than most ranches are worth. The elegance was there, Caleb would give him that. Nothing you could quote back to a judge, nothing that sounded like anything other than concern. Abby let the silence run long enough that Vance's smile began to require more effort to maintain. Then she spoke. "Get off my land, Mayor." Something moved across Vance's face, brief, unguarded, and genuinely unpleasant. Then the composure returned, smooth and immediate as a curtain drawn. He replaced his hat, turned his horse, and rode toward the gate at the same unhurried pace he'd arrived with. Cord followed, but not before letting his gaze linger one moment longer than necessary, a gaze that carried the specific weight of unfinished business. Abby stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded entirely. Then she exhaled, one long, controlled breath, and turned back toward the house. Caleb climbed down from the roof. "He'll be back," he said. "I know," she said, without stopping. "We'll be ready." And for the first time since arriving at Sterling Star in chains, Caleb noticed she'd said, "we." If this story has you hooked, hit that subscribe button and leave a like so this channel keeps bringing you stories that stay with you long after they're done. You won't want to miss what happens next at Sterling Star. The letter had been there all along. That was the part that stayed with Abby as she stood in her father's study that evening, the oil lamp throwing its amber circle across the desk he'd built himself from cedar wood and stubbornness. It had been there through 3 seasons of grief, through the slow unraveling of the ranch's finances, through every morning she'd woken up and chosen to keep going despite the weight of everything pressing down on her solitary shoulders. Sitting in the bottom drawer, beneath a folded survey map of the original Sterling land grant and her father's old Bible, tucked inside an envelope addressed in Elias Miller's careful, deliberate hand. She didn't know what had made her open that drawer tonight. Maybe it was Vance's visit. Maybe it was what Caleb had told her in the barn, the survey, and then a name, assembling itself in her mind all through supper until it pointed her here, the way a compass needle swings and steadies and refuses to point anywhere else. She unfolded the letter and read it properly for the first time. Elias had written it 6 weeks before his death, just as she'd told Caleb, but she had only skimmed it before. Grief does that, makes the words of the dead feel too loud and too quiet at the same time, too much to hold. Now she read every line. "Thomas," he'd written to her father, "I am writing this in some haste and some worry, so forgive me if I am not as plain as I ought to be. There has been a man on my eastern boundary 3 times in the past fortnight. The first time I took him for a lost traveler. The second time I watched him through my glass and saw he carried instruments, a surveyor's transit, I believe, and a ledger book. The third time I rode out to meet him and he was gone before I reached the tree line. His horse carried a brand I have since looked into, a double V. I believe you know whose that is." Abby's hand tightened on the paper. "Thomas, I have been to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, Thomas. What I found there troubles me considerably. There is a survey on record, filed quietly, 18 months ago, under a shell company called Meridian Land Associates, that draws a proposed railway corridor directly through the eastern thirds of both my property and yours. This survey was filed without public notice, which is irregular. When I asked the clerk about it, he became uncomfortable and told me the file was restricted pending a federal review. I pressed him. He asked me to leave. I do not know yet what this means in full, but I know Barnaby Vance sits on the Territorial Railway Commission, and I know Meridian Land Associates was incorporated in his wife's maiden name. "I am going to confront him, Thomas. I know you will tell me to wait, to be careful, to gather more before I act. You have always been the patient one between us. But I am 61 years old, and I have worked this land since before either of our children were born, and I will not have it taken from me in the dark by a man in a good suit. If something happens before I can speak to you in person, look to the eastern boundary, and look after Abigail. She is stronger than she knows. Your friend always, Elias." Abby sat for a long time after she finished reading. The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window, and she steadied it with one hand the way you steady something precious, automatically, without thinking, because some things you protect without needing a reason beyond the fact that they matter. She heard boots on the porch, a single knock. "Lamp still on," Caleb's voice said through the door. "Thought I'd check." She opened it. He stood in the night air with his hat in his hands, reading her face the way men who've survived difficult things learn to read faces, quickly and with genuine attention. She handed him the letter without a word. He read it once, then again, then he looked up. "Meridian Land Associates," he said quietly, incorporated in his wife's maiden name. The night stretched out around them, vast, dark, indifferent, and somewhere out beyond the fence line that they had mended together with their own hands, the eastern boundary of Sterling Star sat silent and knowing nothing, holding its secret in the dry Wyoming earth. "He thought he could bury this," Caleb said. Abby took the letter back, folded it, held it against her chest the same way she'd held her father's deed on the day she'd walked to the gallows and changed both their lives. "He was wrong," she said. The fire came 4 nights later. Caleb smelled it first, that particular sharpness that cuts through sleep like a blade, older than instinct, the kind of alarm the body answers before the mind has finished waking. He was out of the bunkhouse and pulling his boots on before his eyes had fully adjusted to the dark, and by the time he stepped outside, the orange glow on the southern horizon had already grown tall enough to paint the underbelly of the clouds. The grazing pasture, the South 40. He ran. Abby was already there. She'd come from the house with a wet canvas tarp across her shoulders and was beating at the grass fire's leading edge with the focused, relentless energy of a woman who understood exactly what she stood to lose. The fire had taken hold in a long, hungry line, too straight, too even, moving against the night wind rather than with it. Not an accident. Not a stray spark from a campfire or a lightning strike from a clear sky. This was laid deliberately, walked and lit by someone who knew what they were doing. "The cattle," Abby called without looking up. "East corner, move 'em toward the creek." Caleb was already moving. The longhorns were bunched in the far corner of the pasture, pressed against the fence in that particular collective panic of animals who know danger but cannot name it. He came in low and wide, the way you approach frightened cattle. No sudden movements, no shouting, just steady pressure from the right angle, working them the direction they needed to go. They resisted the way frightened things always resist, pushing back against the logic of their own survival, and he moved with them rather than against them, reading the herd the way Elias Miller had probably taught someone, somewhere, the way knowledge passes from old hands to willing ones across generations of hard country. He got them moving, slow at first, then committed, the whole mass of them shifting like water finding its level, heading east toward the creek bank where the wet ground would hold. Hattie appeared from the house with 2 more wet tarps and a bucket brigade mentality, setting herself at the fire's western flank with the grim practicality of a woman who had lived long enough to know that panic wastes time you don't have. She handed Caleb a tarp as he came back from the creek and pointed at the fire's northern edge without ceremony. They worked the line together, the 3 of them, beating and smothering, cutting breaks in the dry grass with a spade Abby had thought to bring, denying the fire its path forward inch by grudging inch. The heat pressed against them like something alive. Embers landed on Caleb's forearms and he ignored them. Abby's hair had come loose from its braid, and the ends of it were singed, and she hadn't stopped moving for a single moment. It took the better part of 2 hours. When the last of it finally guttered out in a hissing, smoke-dark line of scorched earth, the 3 of them stood at the edge of the damage and breathed. The South 40 was gone. 20 acres of good grazing grass reduced to black stubble and the smell of ruin. But the fence line had held. The cattle were safe at the creek. The main pasture, the barn, the house, untouched. They had held the line. Caleb crouched at the fire's origin point and studied the ground in the gray pre-dawn light. 3 separate starting points, evenly spaced, 12 feet apart, scorched in a pattern too deliberate to be anything but intentional. "Cord," he said. Abby crouched beside him, close enough that he could see the exhaustion and the anger moving across her face in equal measure. She looked at the burn pattern, looked at the fence line beyond it, looked at the eastern boundary in the far distance where the secret survey ran through her father's land like a hidden scar. "He wants me frightened," she said. "Is it working?" She turned and looked at him directly, and in the thin gray light of a ruined morning, her face held something he hadn't seen there before. Not bravado, not performance, but the quiet and absolute clarity of a person who has located themselves fully on one side of a line. "No," she said simply. Caleb held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood, offered his hand to help her up, and she took it. Briefly, practically, the way you take something offered in good faith. But neither of them let go quite as quickly as they might have. Hattie, watching from 10 feet away, said nothing, but the expression on her face said everything. The dawn came up slow and gold over Sterling Star, and they walked back toward the house together through the smoke and the ruin and the stubborn, surviving light. It was Hattie who suggested the dance. She raised it over breakfast 3 days later with the particular timing of a woman who understood that the best ideas need to be planted when people are too tired to argue against them. She set a plate of biscuits on the table, poured coffee without being asked, and said casually, too casually, that the Dusty Creek Harvest Social was Saturday, and that Abigail Sterling had not attended a town event in 3 years, and that absence, in Hattie's considered opinion, was a language the town had been reading all wrong. "They think you're hiding," Hattie said. "I'm not hiding," Abby said. "I know that. You know that." Hattie sat down with her own coffee. "Barnaby Vance knows that too, which is exactly why he's counting on you to stay home." The silence that followed had a particular quality to it, the quality of a person recognizing the truth in something they'd rather not recognize. Caleb kept his eyes on his plate and said nothing, which was, he had learned, usually the correct decision around these two women when they were in the middle of something. Abby went to the dance. She wore her mother's blue dress, the good one, freshened and pressed by Hattie with an iron and a determination that brooked no argument, and she came down the porch steps on Saturday evening with her hair pinned properly and her chin at the angle she reserved for things that required courage she didn't feel like explaining. Caleb was waiting by the buckboard in his cleanest shirt, his dark hair combed back, his beard trimmed to something approaching respectability. He'd borrowed a jacket from a hook in the barn that likely belonged to Abby's father. It fit him across the shoulders in a way that suggested Thomas Sterling had been a substantial man. Abby looked at him. He looked at her. "You clean up adequately," she said. "High praise," he said, and offered his hand to help her up. The social was held in the open yard behind the grain exchange, strung with paper lanterns that swayed in the evening breeze like small, cheerful arguments against the dark. A fiddle player and a man with a squeeze box were working through a reel with more enthusiasm than precision. Children ran between adult legs. The smell of wood smoke and roasting corn moved through everything like a thread. The crowd noticed them the moment they arrived. It moved through the gathering the way things move through small towns, a shift of attention, a redirecting of eyes, a rapid, quiet redistribution of whispers. Caleb felt it on his skin the way you feel weather changing. He kept his posture easy and his eyes calm and stayed one deliberate step to Abby's right, close enough to signal presence, far enough to signal respect. Abby walked in like she owned the evening, which, Caleb was beginning to understand, was simply how she walked when she decided to. Mayor Vance was there, naturally. He stood near the punch table with 2 aldermen and a practiced social smile, and when his eyes found Abby across the yard, his expression performed surprise before settling into something harder and more considered underneath. Beside him, Beau Vance, the mayor's son, broad-shouldered and loose-mannered with the particular arrogance of a man who has inherited consequence without earning it, let his gaze travel over Abby with the slow, deliberate rudeness of someone making a point. Caleb noted it, filed it, said nothing. What happened next surprised him. People approached her. Not all of them, and not without hesitation, but enough. Margaret Holt from the dry goods store who had known Abby's mother, old Pastor Crane who shook Caleb's hand with the firm grip of a man reserving full judgment but offering basic decency in the meantime, the blacksmith's wife who asked after the ranch with what appeared to be genuine interest. The town was not, it turned out, a single thing. It never is. When the fiddle player shifted into a slower tune and the yard reorganized itself into dancing pairs, Caleb turned to Abby without particular ceremony and offered his hand. She looked at it, then at him. "I'm not much for dancing," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "We'll be terrible together." Something unlocked in her face, brief, unguarded, and luminous, and she laughed. A real one. Unedited and unplanned, the kind that arrives before a person can decide whether to allow it. She took his hand. They were, as promised, not graceful. They were slightly off the beat and navigating the space between them with the careful negotiation of two people unaccustomed to being held. But they stayed the length of the song, and somewhere in the middle of it, the yard around them seemed to make a quiet collective adjustment. A subtle but permanent reclassification of Abigail Sterling from the woman they'd dismissed to something they hadn't quite named yet but could no longer ignore. Beau Vance watched from the edge of the yard with his jaw tight and his cup untouched. His father watched too, from behind his careful smile, and behind the smile something cold was doing calculations. Caleb walked Abby back to the buckboard when the evening ended, the paper lantern swaying behind them, the fiddle fading into the warm Wyoming night. They rode the 4 miles home in a silence that had changed its character entirely from the silence of that first ride. No longer the silence of two strangers measuring each other's danger, but something more settled, more honest, more like the silence of people who have begun, without quite announcing it, to trust. Hattie was right, Abby said. "She usually is," Caleb said. Abby almost smiled again. She looked straight ahead at the dark road and the lit windows of home, and she let herself have it. The plan came together quietly over the following week, the way serious plans do, not in a single moment of inspiration, but in a gradual accumulation of necessity, each piece finding its place until the shape of the thing became undeniable. They needed the map. Elias's letter named the survey, named the shell company, named the corridor. But a letter from a dead man, written to another dead man, carried by a woman the town had spent years dismissing, that wasn't evidence. That was a story. And Barnaby Vance had demonstrated considerable talent for making inconvenient stories disappear. The map itself, filed under Meridian Land Associates in the mayor's private records, was the only thing that would turn the story into a fact that Iron Jack Ross couldn't look away from. And it was sitting, in all likelihood, in the locked office above Vance's land brokerage on the main street of Dusty Creek. Caleb had been in worse places for worse reasons. He went on a Wednesday, which Hattie confirmed through the precise intelligence network of a woman who attended every church meeting and remembered everything, was the night Mayor Vance hosted his standing card game at the saloon. 3 hours minimum, sometimes 4. A man who held 4 aces rarely hurried home. Abby drove him to the edge of town in the buckboard and stopped where the main street's lamplight didn't quite reach. "You don't have to do this," she said, which was the kind of thing she said when she'd already accepted that a thing was going to happen and simply needed the record to show she'd offered an alternative. "I know," Caleb said, and climbed down. He moved through the back alleys of Dusty Creek the way he'd learned to move through difficult country, unhurried, low, reading each shadow before entering it. The town at night was a different creature than its daytime self, quieter and more honest, its ambitions folded away with the shop awnings, its cruelties temporarily suspended in favor of sleep. The brokerage building had a rear entrance secured with a padlock that was newer and more serious than anything else on the building, which told him immediately that whatever was inside was worth protecting. He worked it with a bent piece of harness wire for 4 minutes before it conceded, the mechanism clicking open with the small, reluctant surrender of something that had trusted in its own permanence. Inside, the office smelled of cedar and pipe tobacco and money. Not the honest smell of earned money, but the airless, accumulated smell of money that had simply attracted more money over time without much physical effort. Caleb kept low, kept his movements tight, and used the thin beam of a hooded lantern to navigate to the filing cabinets along the rear wall. He found the Meridian Land Associates file in the 3rd drawer. It was thicker than he'd expected. Not just a survey map, but a full development portfolio. Correspondence between Vance and a railway commissioner in Cheyenne, cost projections, land acquisition timelines, letters of intent. The survey map itself was folded at the back, large format, hand-drawn with the surveyor's precise and pitiless accuracy. The proposed railway corridor was marked in red ink, running in a clean diagonal line through Elias Miller's former property and directly across the eastern third of Sterling Star. Across land Abby's father had broken his body to hold. Caleb's jaw tightened. He allowed himself exactly 3 seconds of anger, the cold, clarifying kind, and then he folded the relevant documents carefully into his coat and put everything else back precisely as he'd found it. He relocked the cabinet. He relocked the rear door. He was back at the buckboard in 17 minutes. Abby saw his face before he'd said a word. She reached for the documents, and he gave them to her, and she unfolded the survey map in the thin moonlight with hands that were perfectly steady, in the way that hands are steady when their owner has decided that shaking is not an option. She traced the red corridor with one finger, across Elias's land, across her boundary, across the eastern pasture where her father had built his first post the year she was born. She was quiet for a long time. "He killed Elias for this," she said finally, not a question. "And framed me to destabilize you. 2 problems, 1 solution. Very efficient man, the mayor." Abby refolded the map and held it against her chest, the same way she'd held Elias's letter, the same way she'd held the deed at the gallows, like evidence, like armor, like something worth dying for. "We take this to Iron Jack," she said. "He'll need to choose a side. Then it's time he chose." She gathered the reins, her voice carrying the quiet, absolute finality of a woman who had been patient long enough. "Let's go home." The buckboard turned back towards Sterling Star, the map riding safe between them, the dark road opening ahead like a question about to be answered. They didn't make it to Iron Jack that night. Caleb saw the horses at the tree line a 1/4 mile from the ranch gate, 7, maybe 8 of them, standing too still in the darkness to be riderless, their shapes pressed against the shadow of the cottonwoods with the deliberate patience of men who had been told to wait and knew how to do it. He put his hand on Abby's arm without speaking. She felt it and pulled the buckboard to a quiet stop. They sat in the dark and counted. 8 riders, positioned at the main gate, the south fence line, and the tree line east of the barn. Not a spontaneous visit, a coordinated perimeter, the kind you establish when you intend to take something and don't want anything leaving before you're finished. Vance had discovered the missing documents. "Hattie," Abby said, very quietly. "She'll have seen them coming," Caleb said. "She'll be in the root cellar." He said it with more confidence than he entirely felt, but Abby needed it to be true, and so he said it like it was, which was a different kind of courage than the physical sort, but no less real. Abby held the reins and breathed and did her arithmetic, the kind with no numbers, measuring what she had against what was coming. Then she handed Caleb the map, folded small. "Inside your boot," she said, "whatever happens." He tucked it without argument. They left the buckboard in the shadow of a dry creek bed and moved on foot across land Abby had known since before she could name it. This was her advantage, and she understood it completely. Every fold in the terrain, every dry wash and rocky outcropping, every gap in the fence line where the ground dipped low enough to move through unseen. She led, and Caleb followed, and they crossed the southern boundary of Sterling Star like water finding cracks in stone, silent and inevitable. The barn first. Caleb retrieved his rifle from the bunkhouse, while Abby pulled 2 boxes of ammunition from the tack room and the spare shotgun her father had kept oiled and loaded behind the grain barrels since before she was old enough to carry it. She checked it with the brisk, competent movements of a woman who had been taught by a man who believed competence was a form of love. They took their positions. Abby knew the ranch's angles the way a chess player knows the board, where the lamplight from the house created blind spots, where the barn's shadow fell long and useful, where the ground between the main gate and the front porch offered no cover worth mentioning to anyone foolish enough to cross it in a hurry. She sent Caleb to the hayloft with his rifle and a clear line of sight across the yard, and she positioned herself at the corner of the house where 2 walls met and the darkness pooled deepest. They came at the gate first. Cord led them. She recognized his silhouette, the particular set of his shoulders. 6 regulators fanned out behind him with rifles drawn, and the loose, unhurried confidence of men expecting an empty house and a simple job. Abigail Sterling, by order of Mayor Vance and the Territorial Land Commission, this property is hereby seized pending legal review. Come out peaceable, and no harm comes to you. The yard was silent. Then Caleb's rifle spoke from the hayloft, a single shot that took the hat from Cord's head with surgical precision and buried itself in the gatepost 6 inches from his ear. The regulators scattered. What followed was not a Hollywood gunfight of clean lines and heroic silhouettes. It was 20 minutes of controlled chaos, men using the fence line for cover, Caleb working the hayloft with the methodical patience of someone who understood that accuracy mattered more than volume, Abby holding the south corner and turning back 2 men who tried to flank through the yard with a shotgun blast that took out the fence post between them and reminded them that the distance between bravery and stupidity was thinner than they'd calculated. She wasn't shooting to kill, she was shooting to hold. There's a difference, and she knew it. The terrain did its work. The regulators were men hired for intimidation, not for fighting people who knew the ground beneath their own feet. The darkness that hindered them was familiar to Abby, every shadow exactly where she knew it would be, every line of approach exactly where her father had once told her a man would come if a man ever came with bad intentions. He had prepared her for this. She understood that now. One by one, the regulators pulled back, first to the fence line, then to the gate, then beyond it, regrouping in the darkness of the cottonwoods where their horses waited. Cord stood at the gate a moment longer than the others, his hatless head pale in the moonlight, and looked across the yard at the house and the barn and the dark, unyielding land between them. Then he turned and rode. The silence that followed was enormous and clean. Caleb came down from the hayloft. Abby came around the corner of the house. They met in the middle of the yard and stood in the dark, both breathing harder than they would have admitted, the smell of gunpowder and kicked dust settling around them like punctuation. From the root cellar behind the house came the sound of a bolt being drawn back, and then Hattie emerged into the moonlight with a cast-iron skillet in one hand and a look on her face that suggested she had been prepared to use it. "Well," she said, surveying the yard with the brisk assessment of a woman tallying damage, "they'll be back." "Not tonight," Caleb said. "No," Abby agreed. She was looking at the gate, at the fence line, at the land her father had built and her mother had loved, and she had bled to keep. Her voice was steady and certain and carried something in it that had not been there 4 weeks ago when Caleb Thorne had arrived at Sterling Star in chains. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. The map was still in his boot. Iron Jack Ross lived 6 miles up the valley road, and the truth, which had been buried long enough, was finally ready to come up into the light. They rode out before dawn. Hattie stayed with the ranch, armed with the cast-iron skillet and a stubbornness that Caleb had come to regard as roughly equivalent to a fortified position. Abby rode with the map tucked inside her coat and Elias's letter folded beside it. And Caleb rode with his rifle across his saddle and the particular alertness of a man who has stopped waiting for trouble and started expecting it. Iron Jack Ross answered his door in his undershirt with a lantern and the expression of a man whose sleep had not been peaceful for some considerable time. He looked at Abby. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the documents Abby spread across his kitchen table without waiting to be invited. He read in silence. The survey map first, then the Meridian Land Associates correspondence, then Elias's letter, which he read twice, the second time more slowly, his jaw working slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he is processing something that rearranges what he thought he knew about the past 2 years of his life. When he finished, he set the letter down and was quiet for a long moment. "Cord's testimony," he said finally. "I knew it came in too clean." "You knew?" Abby said. Not an accusation, just a fact delivered plainly in the manner of someone who had decided that plain facts were the only currency worth spending this morning. Iron Jack looked at her with the eyes of a man settling an account with himself. "I had a feeling. Feelings don't hold up in a territorial court." "Evidence does," Caleb said, and nodded at the table. The sheriff dressed without further discussion. By 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, the main street of Dusty Creek had become the kind of towns that towns remember for generations, not because of the violence, which was minimal, but because of the quality of the reckoning, which was complete. Iron Jack walked into the mayor's office with the survey documents and 2 deputies, and Abby walked in behind him and Caleb behind her, and what Barnaby Vance saw when he looked up from his desk was the specific and terminal expression of a man watching the architecture of his ambitions collapse from the foundation up. He reached for words, found several, discarded them all. Cord's testimony was taken into custody at the saloon before he'd finished his first drink of the morning, which, given the previous night's events, suggested either tremendous composure or a profound failure of self-preservation. 2 other regulators surrendered without ceremony. Bo Vance, the mayor's arrogant son, was found attempting to leave town by the South Road with 2 saddlebags full of his father's private ledgers, which turned out to be the single most useful thing he'd ever done for anyone other than himself. The ledgers confirmed everything. By midday, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office with the particular energy of people who have discovered they were deceived. Not the hungry, performative anger of the gallows crowd from weeks before, but something quieter and more serious. The anger of people reassessing what they'd allowed and who they'd trusted and what it had cost. Margaret Holt from the dry goods store stood near the front of the crowd. The blacksmith's wife, Pastor Crane, people who had danced on Saturday and now stood on Thursday with their faces changed. They watched Barnaby Vance walk out of his office in Iron Jack's custody, and the town that had gathered for a hanging 7 weeks ago gathered now for something else entirely. The slower, more permanent justice of a man being held accountable for what he actually done, in the daylight, in front of everyone. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment, but nobody looked away either. They rode back to Sterling Star in the late afternoon when the Wyoming sky had gone that particular shade of gold that makes even ruined things look briefly beautiful. The South 40 was still scorched, the barn still needed 2 weeks of work, the cattle were still lean, and the fencing still had opinions about its own integrity. But the gate was theirs. The deed was clear. The land stretched out in every direction under a sky that belonged to no railroad commission and no man in a good suit. Caleb tied the horses while Abby climbed the porch steps. Then she stopped and turned and looked at him in the gold light with the expression of a woman who had arrived somewhere she wasn't sure she'd ever get to. She sat on the top step. After a moment,
He sat beside her. They looked out across Sterling Star, the fence lines they'd mended, the pasture they'd defended, the barn they'd rebuilt timber by timber, and the silence between them was the fullest kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need filling because it already contains everything that matters. "Your 5 years start over," Abby said quietly, "if you want 'em." Caleb was still for a moment. The last light moved across the land, slow and golden and unhurried. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Hattie appeared in the doorway behind them with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a woman who had known exactly how this was going to end from approximately the 3rd day, and had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. She set the cups down between them, patted Abby once on the shoulder, and went back inside without a word. The sun went down over Sterling Star, and for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, Abigail Sterling let herself believe that the hardest chapter was behind her, and that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. If this story moved you, if you stayed all the way to the porch with Abby and Caleb, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me which chapter gripped you hardest, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And if someone in your life needs a story about courage, grit, and unexpected love, share this with them right now. More stories are coming. Don't miss them.